Great to meet you all. Yeah, great to be here, guys. First off, you might be wondering why I've rolled my sleeves up. I don't know if it was like the rest of you, but when I arrived here this morning and I put my shirt on the first time in, like, what is it, 2 years now, I discovered that I've not only got a bit bolder around the edge with those COVID calories, but I somehow got longer arms. So that's why I'm doing that, not because. But anyway, down to business. So today what we're going to talk about is the evolution of threat intelligence in the context of APT threat landscapes. So my name is Andrew Yeates. I work for Reversing Labs. I'm one of the solutions architects here at Reversing Labs. So over the next sort of 45 minutes, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less, we're going to go into a number of key topics. So first off, we're going to look at what is the typical latest threat intelligence we have around the construct of objects and files. Now, what we see and how these APT threat actors are really trying to function in today's world. What kind of techniques, evasion techniques, how they're getting into the organization, how they're trying to actually cause harm to the organization, and what does that look like in the context of those traditional security tools. Now, what we're not talking about is, things like antiviral softwares and sandboxes, and not saying that, they're not really important, because fundamentally when we get into this, what we're looking at is that they absolutely have a right place and the right time, but we're looking at the latest and greatest of really advanced persistent threat techniques in this particular marketplace, and how we need to adapt and evolve to really protect against those really advanced persistent threats as we go forward. So we're going to start looking at how we unpack and look at those traditional methods, right? So sandboxes and AVs are going to be the two major components I talk about, and we're going to bring in the concept of things like static file analysis. Just quick show of hands, anybody familiar with static file analysis? Yeah, we've got one over there. Yeah, he says he does, but he really doesn't, so I joke anyway. Okay, great. And then we're going to talk about sandboxes in a bit more detail. So why is it that these threat actors are able to actually compromise an organization despite the fact of the millions of pounds that these organizations are putting in place today? And we'll start unpacking that in a little bit more detail. How we need to evolve, so what are these fundamental changes? Today's session is not really about being a sales pitch to you guys at all. It's about giving you this intelligence, really about understanding where do we actually see probably the market needs to go and evolve. And that's not about what we do, it's about what actually needs to come in the future. And then what we're going to do is actually a very quick live demo. I've got two scenarios. So fingers crossed the malware actually works, but we're going to look at the Everbee. Anybody familiar with Everbee ransomware attack? Yes. And Sodden Kenobi, base 64 encoded payload. There we go. All right, cool. Awesome. So we'll have a look at some of those. All right, so first thing, and let's keep this clean, yeah? But what do you guys, I'll get some opinions around the room. What do you lose sleep over the most, do you feel like, from a cyber perspective? What type of things? And what are you most concerned about? Any volunteers? You guys going to be quiet the whole time? Ransomware? Yeah, it's a really great one. That's a really common one. Any others? Climate change. Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, it definitely has an impact even within cybersecurity, right? And people going after those types of organizations. Change control, another really great point there. Absolutely. So these are all topics that we've heard about over the last sort of 2 to 3 years, and absolutely really prevalent, especially things like ransomware and change control and more kind of social political type attacks. But something that when I was asked to do this session, I tried to think about what are the conversations I've had over the last year and a half that I feel is a really prevalent topic, and really it's about being patient zero. So what do we mean by patient zero? Does anybody want to take that? Anybody want to give their kind of opinion on what patient zero is?
The entry point.
Yeah, the first person that might have been attacked by that particular malicious object, right? And this is, again, really starting to understand some of the fundamental drawbacks of that traditional threat intelligence component, right? Because it fundamentally works on signatures. Somebody has to be breached first. Somebody has to have had that attack. They have to have been compromised in order for that to really been seen before. And you could be that patient zero. A great example of that is Stuxnet. And I know this is a really, really old example, right? But we go back way back then, during, I think it was 2009 when Stuxnet came out, there was loads of zero-day type attacks that were embedded within that attack. It was well orchestrated. Fundamentally, somebody had to be the zero-day, but half the computers across the network had already had some form of this, and it was an indirect impact to their organization in some form or another. So today's session is really going to start thinking about being patient zero, right? So that's the core focus. So as you go through these slides, I want you to keep that in mind and remember that we're focusing this around zero trust. and being that patient zero, and how you could potentially think about these organizations, whether it's your future career or your current career that you're working in. How do we prevent being patient zero? So the latest types of constructs of attacks that I've seen over the last is really that we're starting to see a real influx and increase in the amount of attacks that start to use unique payload wrappers. So fundamentally, what an APT threat actor does, and we're actually going to look at this with, I think it's the Everbee attack, what the threat actor group does is they have the same malicious script, and then what they're doing is they're wrapping it in a unique payload which changes the overall signature of the file, and then sending that to every organization. Now, the problem with that is, at some point, the organization probably will detect, based on their vast array of other security investment products, that they've been attacked, and that will get pushed out to some wider threat intelligence company. They'll update a feed, and it'll get pushed down again. But fundamentally, you're going to end up in the same situation where it's a unique payload, right? It's not going to look the same, and a lot of these traditional kind of approaches that a lot of us have in our organization, they're really looking at it from the perspective of probably going 1 or 2 layers down within that file to actually understand what's embedded within it, or even things like sandbox. And as we'll look at in a bit later, there's fundamentally a lot of kind of limitations to those types of tools with these types of attacks as well. Next thing is about obscure file types. So look, I think the kind of the flavor here is that, you know, the threat actor groups, what they're trying to do is whenever we put something in place, they're trying to find a way around what we're doing. And so another thing is really obscure file types, right? Again, sandboxes, really great, powerful technology, but something I've really seen over the last year or 2 years, there's been a huge increase in the different types of those different file types. So you're not just looking at things like Word documents and PDFs and portable executable files. It's the really obscure stuff like, you know, Android ABK stuff, OS, Flash, and all these other various different flavors within that. And that's the difficulty, is because they're trying to find ways that we won't be able to analyze or inspect those particular objects. And again, sandboxes, they only handle a very small, you know, small volume of certain file types. And maintaining those environments can be very, very complex and challenging. The next thing is just quite simply embedding evasion techniques within those particular types of pieces of malware and scripting that actually obfuscate or hide themselves from the overall detection within those platforms. So again, we'll come on to this a little bit later when we talk about some of the limitations, but things like logic bombs is a great example, looking at hardware specifications and so forth. Of course, it wouldn't be really a proper slide if I didn't put up supply chain attacks. I think everybody in the room is probably familiar with SolarWinds. I'm not going to go into detail. I've got another session that goes into that. But of course, Kodakov is another great example. And then, of course, things like, you know, Fancy Bear coming out with things like more firmware attacks. Again, the real flavor here is that they're just trying to find ways to get around whatever security measures are put in place. So again, even what I'm talking about, on that future landscape, at some point, 5, 10, 15 years' time, we're going to have to evolve again, right? It's going to be that constant cycle. We can't just say, you know, no, if any vendor ever came to you and says, this is your silver bullet for life, I would show them the door, because they're talking absolute rubbish. There's no such thing as a silver bullet, but there's certain things we can put in place to really significantly increase how we protect ourselves. So let's talk about the construction of objects today, right? So how has it changed over this last 10, 15, 20 years, and how we typically kind of saw those files originally? Well, you know, we're looking at super large objects now. You know, before, you know, you probably have 1 or 2 100 megabyte files, maybe a couple of gig files. You know, some files that organizations are using today, hundreds of gigs, right? If you're getting some kind of, let's say, a virtual machine, you could be getting a virtual machine from somebody. Embedded within that virtual machine could be malicious content, right? And that could be hundreds of gigs to analyze. So actually, the job of a security operations center is increasingly more difficult and more time consuming because it's just unfeasible to do that in a manual approach. Next thing is just the volume of different file formats. I mean, I think, you know, we're looking at thousands of different file formats now. And, you know, fundamentally, when we look at the analysis, part of what you do when you do malware analysis, and perhaps some of you in the room may be specialists in this, there's fundamentally 2 major ways in which you analyze malware. You either detonate it, which is dynamic analysis, right? So you're putting it in a sandbox, you know, it's a nice, safe little environment, and you let it run, and you see what the output is, and you see the capability of the file. It's very much a black box, right? You don't care what the inner workings of that file does. What you care is the extraction of it. Where does it link out to? What does it change on the disk of the file? What modifications is it making? The second thing is static file analysis, and this goes back years and years and years ago. This is a really traditional way took huge amounts of technical knowledge. You had to be absolutely skilled in it. And what you're fundamentally doing is understanding against the specification of a file. So let's say a Word document. A Word document is going to have a header, it's going to have RCSCs, it's going to have resource components within the format structure of that file. What you're doing with static file analysis is looking at that specification and saying, against what we see here, is there anything that isn't quite right? And you do that looking at the actual binaries of the data from the file itself. Now, the problems with static file analysis traditionally is that static file analysis is very much a manual step, right? It requires a lot of technical knowledge as well. And so fundamentally, the problem there is you'd probably only go 3 or 4 levels. Now, again, if we're looking at super large objects, that could be hours and hours to really analyze every one of those objects, okay? So again, you know, there's, especially with file formats, it's something that really aggravates that situation. Doing static file analysis, you've got to understand what the specification of that file is. Row containers. So row containers are essentially things like, what's that IBM product they've just purchased? I can't remember. I used to work for IBM. This is really embarrassing. I should know this. Yeah, it's Red Hat, but there's a product within it, and it's container stuff. OpenShift. Yes, good man. That's what I was thinking of. So that's fundamentally containers. Containers is about being able to move applications that are all pre-packaged up. It has all the resources, all the files, all the certificates, APA keys, everything you need to essentially run it. And the great thing about that is that you can move that application from one OS to another OS, and there's no problem. It's easy. But it creates additional security risks because now you've got all this other stuff that's packaged up with it. You've got large products, you've got certificates in there, you've got APA keys, you've got sensitive data. Again, you know, another headache for organizations to really try and understand. And the next thing is really about certificates. Again, it's a common thing these days. We all try to put in additional security measures, whether it's crypto or certificates and all these other components. But fundamentally, you know, threat actors then try to use that against us one way or another. And then finally, I think I kind of touched on this, but that layer upon layer, right, you know, it's just, you could be having a file that has 4,000 or 5,000 different objects within that file that you've got to inspect and analyze. And, you know, you've got to find that needle in the haystack. It could be one file, it could be one class. You look at the Kodakov attack, you know, over a period of time, every time there was a sprint, and he actually made modifications to their actual code base, he actually just introduced a blank code, a blank class within the code initially. And then all it was just an IP address that was siphoning off data. Really, really difficult to detect that kind of stuff, right? Because it's a behavioral change. There's nothing malicious about putting an IP address in. It's not using like wincrypt32.dll to encrypt the hard drive. It's just quite simply siphoning stuff off to an IP. And that was within, you know, typical kind of behavior. So, yeah, this is where we are today. This is the challenges that not just organizations, but all of us really kind of face. It's just that organizations, you know, in the context of those threat actor groups, they're going to go after them because that's where the money is, that's where the political gain is. You know, our risk vector as individuals is probably significantly less to that. So let's talk a little about AVs, right? Now, AVs, again, absolutely have a place in our organization. Really important. They're going to protect us from 90% of those threats. You know, the script kiddies, you know, the people that are buying commonality malware. To be perfectly honest, like, I'm not really too worried about, you know, those kind of people that necessarily are finding that malware. What I'm really worried and what keeps me up at night, sorry about that, is the APT threats, right? But, you know, in terms of how AV works and where we start to think about the limitation with these platforms is that they're extraction data from, you know, website scraping. You might be looking at honeypots, where they're just, you know, scraping out and trying to capture people. You've got malware flying across the internet, you know, dark web crawling, this type of stuff, you know. People, the malware that's already been seen before, okay, is kind of what we're getting at. Now, in terms of an AV process, it could look like this, right? So an organization could get a number of different files. It could be ransomware, it could be an encrypted PDF, it could be a phishing attack of some kind with an attachment, right? Any one of thousands of different file types. The first thing you're going to do as an organization is you're probably going to send that into your AV tool. It can execute on the endpoint. Your AV is going to kick off and it's going to be like, right, have I seen the signature? And it's going to think, all right, awesome. Haven't seen it, so what does an AV do? AV comes back and says it's either malicious or it's unknown. Well, what happens if it's unknown because it's not goodware, but because it just is malicious, we've just not seen it? Again, first problem of typical kind of threat intelligence. when we look at these types of tools that we've got in place today, it's very difficult in the world of automation to automate something when we're not actually calling out when something is goodware. And you might stand in the room today and say, well, it's really difficult to know for certain if that is goodware. But again, we've got to start making gains in that space to really start to highlight when we know for certain that something is goodware. Or what alternatively could happen is it could go to an AV vendor itself and it could actually be analyzed. And as that kind of, my really bad skill at designing PowerPoints, this is like a 20-minute done. But I try to push it into the AV. The AV might actually reach out to the AV scanner because it's not seen it before. And they might do some analysis. It might require actually some manual intervention. Somebody might sit there, they might try and unpack it, they might even apply static file analysis, maybe even use a sandbox or something. And that's probably going to take in excess of 8 hours, right? And that's then eventually going to get pushed to an AV signature list, and then that's going to go back down to the AV scanner result. And the long and short of all of this is that you may get an alert, right? But again, that patient zero, so we'll look at some of these attacks. The Everbee one is a great example of this. AVs are just not going to detect everything because of the way that they're wrapping a lot of their stuff in unique payloads now. And so actually when it comes to detecting the real patient zero stuff, we need to change the way that we're actually approaching some of these, these processes in which we investigate an incident. So let's jump over to more of the kind of sandbox side of things. Right, so okay, right, AVs have a place. Let's talk about sandboxes. Okay, absolutely great. Detonate a file, see what it's capable of doing, get the extraction of from the the network counts. Is it pulling down additional droppers to install? It's all about, do we see anything that we think is malicious? And typically, I've never had a bad experience with a sandbox. I think sandboxes are great. I think actually in the context of broader security tools like Seams, the actual amount of false positives is actually not too bad. I think they're pretty good. Of course, that requires a bit of tuning, as it would with any of these kind of Seam platforms and so forth. But the limitation is, like, again, as things stand today, a lot of these threat groups, they know full well that organizations are using sandboxes and they're detonating the malware to see what happens. So they put in evasive techniques, such as it requires some kind of user interaction. If they don't see that, the malware doesn't see that the mouse is wiggling and somebody's actually going to click on it and all that stuff, it's not going to trigger off. Or it could be system characteristics. Does it look like that machine is used by an actual person? And like by that I mean, is there specific, the amount of time that the machine's been up, how often it's used, is it particular time ranges? There's loads and loads of different characteristics they fundamentally embed within a lot of this malware for the evasive side of things. You've got the environmental side of things. There's specific NICs involved, right? So you've got your VMware or whatever, the hypervisor that's sitting under it, that's actually understanding what's going on. They're trying to detect a lot of that stuff. I mean, there's some threat groups, when I've been looking at malware the last sort of 6 months, and they've put in really interesting things that are more kind of political based, such as if it has a language pack that is Russian, it won't detonate. And that's because obviously, if you're a hacker in Russia, you do not want to be hacking a Russian laptop or computer accidentally, because they don't take that very kindly. They don't care if you go out and necessarily do something outside of those types of countries, but having that kind of stuff within your computer gives a real insight to that kind of geopolitical landscape. And then finally, logic bombs. So we're not going to detonate for the first 30 days. Okay, just simple things like that. Specific things just to evade the standard processes in which how organizations would use something like this. Just a quick time check. Okay, so time consumption, takes 15 minutes on average. Most organizations are getting thousands and thousands of files a day minimum. We have some customers of actually ours that are doing millions of files per day, and that's really difficult when probably got a limit of around, with scalability, most sandboxes probably about 20,000. I have seen some theoretically go up to about 900,000, but again, it's hugely expensive. It's very difficult. And we then start, thinking about what is the ROI, and organizations just can't keep pumping money after money after money, because security cost is just going to get out of hand, and it's the end users that are going to pay for it. And then, limited file type recognition. So what I've done here is just a comparison between what static file analysis does and what, dynamic analysis. So the advantage of the, dynamic analysis is that you get any additional network component. If you're downloading a dropper or something like that, that's a great advantage to using something like dynamic analysis. But in reality, I think organizations probably only need to use it a very small amount of time. We've come along a long way now with static file analysis. In fact, there's loads of tools out there that are fully automated in applying static file analysis. So the idea is that you could actually analyze thousands of files in a very short time frame, get a very quick verdict over what is malicious within that, and then only send a very small amount of that to your dynamic analysis. But again, we'll come on to this in a little bit more detail around the approaches that could be possible and how we need to adapt as we go forward. But that's my next slide. So how do we need to evolve, right? And we start to unpack some of those challenges. So on the left-hand side, just examples of the different types of files that you might have coming into your organization, right? We need to be very consciously aware that whatever solution the organization or process that they're putting it in place, they need to understand, maybe even from a policy standpoint to their organization, limit what are we going to say is acceptable different file formats. Okay, we can't just allow everything potentially because the organization just wouldn't be able to analyze everything like that. We need to have an ability to actually understand and identify those various different file formats in that regard. The organization and how we actually analyze these files as we go forward, we need to really think about how we're able to unpack and deobfuscate. A great example is portable executable files, PE files. It's like 400 different packers. That's very, very difficult, and again, it's another technique that threat actor groups are using to pack files that are simply then being evaded through other detection methods, such as, again, sandboxes. File reputation lookup, there's existing threat intelligence stuff. Again, it's really, really important. We need to get better at sharing information. I think there's absolutely a time and a place for certain threat feeds and threat sharing information, but we don't just need to get better at sharing information, but also keeping it private to the correct individuals and the correct organizations, because VirusTotal is a great example where you upload a file, it could be a sensitive document, it could be a sensitive hash, and that gets shared with loads of other organizations, and threat groups actually monitor things like VirusTotal now to keep an eye out to see if that file, that piece of malware that they've got out there, again, if you've got a unique payload, that's what they're looking for. And once they see that, they're just going to play all their cards and they're going to get out as quickly as they can. So you don't want to spook a threat actor. So again, file reputation and picking not just the right one, but thinking about that privacy is incredibly important. Threat indications. We need to do huge amounts of work in this industry to really understand those threat indicators, how to extract that. What are the types of capabilities that these threat groups are going after? What are they looking at? How can we identify and improve the overall behavior detection of it? Functional similarity, just trying to evaluate and actually understand how do these malwares actually relate to each other, because this is very much a SAW concept, right? So your process in which how you approach every single attack. As you approach a ransomware, that's going to be very different to how you approach, let's say, a Trojan horse. Or a DDoS attack, or commonality malware, or even something like a lost USB. Understanding the various different flavors of malware, let's say, is really important to actually dictate how you actually flow through that process. And then finally, we need to think about how we classify these various different threat levels. The amount of times I've seen threat feeds come in from various different vendors over the years, and everything's always flagged as super malicious. And it's just like, where's the priority in that, guys? Everything can't be a P1. So picking, again, a threat intelligence that really helps you to understand the impact, right? The risk and the impact of these threats and put it in the context of your organization is incredibly important. And of course, we need to work on how we actually do that dynamic analysis as an industry, right? And just along the bottom right, millions of files per day. Our organizations are going to grow. We're going to be taking in more files. This is going to get bigger and bigger. Results in milliseconds. We cannot be waiting 15 minutes for us to get a result back from a sandbox. That's just not going to scale when we have a zero trust methodology, which is the big thing now, isn't it? And that's the kind of capabilities we need to get as an output from this. So, are you all still with me? I haven't bored you all to death yet. All good, yeah. Guys, you don't talk much, come on. Get involved. Right, so this is where I was always told never to do live demos because they go wrong, but we're going to do it anyway. So who wants to start with sandbox and who wants to start with threat intelligence? Who wants to go first? Put your hand up for threat intelligence. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, cool. Oh, 5, yeah. Who wants to go for does sandbox, yeah? Oh, I think it's sandbox first. And to be honest, we might only have time for one because I talk too much. So, oh, now you guys laugh. Okay, all right, good stuff. So, let's go for the Sodding Kenobi. All right, so some of you put your hand up and said you were familiar with Sodding Kenobi, right? Okay, yeah, cool. So Sodding Kenobi, this is a part of the chain of attack. We're only going to start looking at the entry point. What happens here is it's actually an agent.crt, that's a certificate file. This certificate file is actually got some malware embedded within it. And what we're going to do is go through the process of actually unpacking and seeing what they've done here. It's a very quick kind of demo and probably we'll have time to look at it. Now, where this really evades detection with a lot of sandboxes is actually this particular agent.crt and how they approach it and evade that detection is within that certificate itself. I don't know if any of you want to take a stab at what that is. Yeah, it's code, yeah. And it's encoded. So it's base 64. So again, what happens in a sandbox? You're going to load that certificate into your sandbox, and when it goes into your sandbox, it's going to boot up certutil, and it's going to try and run it. And then it's going to realize it's base 64 encoded, and it's just going to throw a wobbly, and it probably won't do anything. And again, it's a really simple technique. It's going to evade detection by a lot of other security tools because it's base 64 encoded, and only if it's on a customer's environment. An actual endpoint's being used by an end user that probably has various different modules running in it. It might even download to say, hey, I've got to do X, Y, Z. And the user's not going to think anything of it. So what happens when we actually unpack that base 64? And so we'll have a look at this in a little bit more detail. Unfortunately, there's not, using this particular tool today, this A1000, it makes the investigation, it sounds like such a salesy thing, but you go through the investigation quite quickly. But what we do is, so if I decode that base 64, which is done here for me, I drill into it. Actually, what happens with this agent.crt file is embedded within it was actually the REvil attack within it. So again, if we start to actually look down at the particular capabilities of what that REvil attack was, we can see here, based on some of this stuff, like we spoke before, there's evasion techniques to prevent security products from actually detecting it. So even if the base 64 itself was decoded and somehow somebody did that via manual detection, or maybe some other security products, they're doing layer upon layer of evasion techniques. And this is a great example where they're targeting very specific security tools within that to actually evade that. Now, in terms of the overall capability of this REvil attack, what they're doing there is they've got ability around execution. So executing file, being able to terminate processes, again, could be used from an evasion technique, terminating certain processes that prevent additional access. Any references to service modules as well. So again, allowing some capability around the .NET runtime. So this is a very quick kind of look at a great example where a sandbox just simply would not detect that type of attack. Now what I'm going to do now is I'll flick over to the Everbee. I think this is probably, given we've got 9 minutes left, we'll just skip over to this. So this here, and we'll do this as a great example, right? So I actually loaded up VirusTotal, and again, no beef with VirusTotal, right? They're really great. They've got lots of data on A/B stuff, and it absolutely has a place. And so they've detected this, right? So 50% of A/B scanners, right, flagged up and said, yeah, this instance of Everbee, we've seen it before, no biggie, you're all good. Well, the APT group that actually put this together, they were actually wrapping it in a unique payload every single time. So again, maybe what we could do here is we'll go down to the extracted files, and it's a PE file. So it was actually using UPX that was a packed file. So again, evades detection by some of those other different tools and doesn't realize there's something packed within it that is actually the malicious components. It was originally actually branded as RansomCrypt against a lot of threat intelligence kind of feeds when I was initially looking at this attack. Now, what I do here is I'm just going to very quickly take that hash of the embedded malicious script of everb that was within that as a packed UPX file, and now put it through VirusTotal, and it doesn't find it. No AV's ever seen that before. Even though it's been circulated thousands and thousands of times, it's always going to be wrapped in a unique payload, and that particular file had never been seen. So to me, and this isn't the first instance, there's loads and loads of examples of particular files where when you really break down what's going on, they're wrapping it every single time. And so those AV scanners, threat intelligence feeds, all of that, they absolutely have a place. They're going to protect you 90% of it. But what about that small volume of different attacks where they're really targeting you? How are you going to unpack and understand those particular types of malicious software? So, great question. So, I'm not a CrowdStrike engineer, but they do, that's next generation AV. So next gen AV does have, essentially the CrowdStrike stuff is more like an EDR type platform. So what they're looking at is essentially the execution on the endpoint. So it's very similar to what happens with things like sandboxes, right? So it probably would have detected the everb attack, but could have in theory allowed some execution of things like the Sodden Kenobi type attack. Yeah, so EDRs definitely have a place and they are important, but you're putting a lot, it's your final wall of defense before execution. The idea here, and something I probably haven't mentioned, is that how we apply security should be zero trust before we get to an endpoint. It should be layered security. So something I was actually about to finish on is that as soon as something comes into your organization, whether it's a firewall that does it or it just dumps onto something like an SMB or S3 bucket, we should be applying security measures to zero trust that particular object before it even gets to an endpoint, right? Because it gets to the endpoint, if there's something goes wrong or the agent isn't available or it's overloaded, that's too late, isn't it? So it's about layered security with these things. Does that hopefully answer your question with CrowdStrike? It's probably the best I can do. I'm not a CrowdStrike engineer, right? So it's all right. But EDRs definitely have a place, right? Okay, so I'm just going to do my closing statement. Right, so, all right. So can I work? There you go. So my idea is that zero trust is absolutely where we should be going towards. There's never going to be one tool that is going to solve everything, and I think that's a really great point there. There's absolutely going to be other tools that are going to have great approaches of detecting stuff. CrowdStrike is a fantastic platform. It has an AV that is more like an EDR, and EDRs are good, but if EDRs were so amazing, we wouldn't be hearing about breaches in the news every single day. And my idea here is not about coming along and saying, hey, buy reversing labs. It's trying to give you the reality and the picture of what is actually going on in today's world and how these attacks are working. Fundamentally, what we're seeing in the marketplace and where we're going to have to evolve over the next few years is trying to apply multiple different techniques, and static file analysis is just one of those that could potentially help with that kind of picture. But whatever we put in, whatever organizations are thinking about investing, it's got to be around a zero trust approach, right? We cannot be going along this typical kind of route of saying, here's a sandbox and it only does 20,000 files per day, because that's just not going to scale. And how do you select what those 20 files are? Because it's probably already executed on the endpoint by that point. AVs, they're fundamentally great, again, but they're not going to detect everything. And so, if you're a small, medium-sized enterprise, your risk vector is probably quite small, and maybe that suits where you are and you've gone through your cyber essentials. But if you're a large corporation, then you've got to start thinking about other things, static file analysis, dynamic analysis, EDRs, and so forth. Things like SOAR, right? We talk about that AV earlier. 8 hours potentially to get a feed updated, within an AV feed. Within SOAR, one of the key things everybody bought SOAR for was because of the reduction in time to respond and how the talk of, minutes matter, right? And if you've got 8 hours and it's a ransomware attack, those 8 hours is a hell of a long time for that to be encrypting across your estate. So in terms of reducing that SOR, we need to start understanding what files are good and really get better around how can we actually improve the overall triage of an incident, taking in ingestion of data, and actually having a higher degree of just saying, this is malicious or suspicious, and getting better with those playbooks. Again, augmenting sandboxes with some level of static file analysis, I think, is probably the biggest change I've seen over the last probably 1 or 2 years, and I think is definitely where I think organizations will start to invest over the next coming sort of 5-10 years to augment that sandbox, because we're now starting to get to that point of limitation with it. And then finally, yes, just incorporate something that starts to do the ability to unpack encoded or packed files, especially ones that are going to start recursively analyzing a lot of those. Attackers are really starting to embed these attacks within 1 or 2 files within thousands. So you could wait for the behavior to be detected, but by that point, I personally think it's too late. Anyway, so with that, I'm going to pause there. Thank you ever so much for your time. I think I've got 2 minutes for questions, and I'll open up.
You do indeed. Can we get a round of applause first, actually?
Yeah.
If you have questions, we do have 2 minutes, so awesome.
And your first description on there for the Solomon no Kiwi or Kenobi.
Sodden Kenobi, yeah.
Yeah. You've seen the sort of like a package that was delivered and how it was embedded in the certificate.
Yeah.
Surely you should be able to look at the size of that certificate and say, this is too
Correct.
big.
So that is another method of doing the analysis, but you'd be surprised how few organizations look at the overall info of that file and say, crikey, 800, oh, it's still on that, for God's sake. Yeah.
3 times the size of it.
Yeah, it's 890 kilobytes of file. It's base64 encoded. Obviously, base64 could reduce the overall size of it, but that could be an indicator. Problem is, though, is that enough to really say it's malicious or not? And that's the problem. It goes to somebody to say, manually investigate it, and that brings us back to the skills problem, the volume problem, rather. So it could be an indicator, but I think what we need to do here, being able to detect that it's base64 is a bigger indicator that it's something malicious than the overall file size, but it's absolutely an indicator of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I think we are running out of time for questions, so I think we deserve another round of applause for that. Thank you very much.
Cool.
Excellent.
Thanks very much.
Sam?